I'm the Talking Skull, and this year I'm exploring classic first-person shooters to draw a line from Wolfenstein 3D to Halo. This week we're looking at Rise of the Triad. This is gonna be a rough one. In the early 90s, Apogee worked closely with id and published their games. When id decided to go independent after Wolfenstein 3D, Apogee missed out on the unbelievable success of Doom and Doom 2. Now, lacking their star developers and seeking to get back in on the newly profitable FPS genre, Apogee brought on former id creative director Tom Hall, who had been forced out of id for not agreeing with Carmack and Romero's vision for Doom. With Hall at the helm, Apogee would make their first in-house attempt at an FPS. You may wonder why I'm choosing to cover Rise of the Triad Dark War. It's not a well-known game, and its reviews at the time were just okay. Apogee's not exactly a household name in the FPS scene, so why bother, right? Wrong. In the mid-90s, Apogee would rebrand its 3D games division as 3D Realms, and go on to make Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior. 3D Realms is one of the biggest names in the 90s FPS scene, and it all starts here, with their first attempt to recapture that magic they missed out on with id. But whatever was in the air at Apogee, I would hesitate to call it magic. Rise of the Triad was made using the Wolfenstein 3D engine. Yes, the Wolfenstein engine, not the Doom engine. id had parted ways, and took their new engine with them. Without a star programmer to rival John Carmack, Apogee settled on using the primitive engine they already had. A lot of work was done to spruce up this already aging tech. Rise of the Triad implements cool new features like destructible objects, breakable glass, bullet holes in walls, and unrestricted key rebinding. These are real innovations, many of which would be pulled forward into Duke Nukem 3D and get tons of praise. They've managed to get ceilings and skyboxes working, along with some very limited verticality. There's also a unique weapon system where your standard assault rifle has unlimited ammo, but you pick up and use various special weapons throughout the levels. Run out of ammo? Just grab a new one. You can, select your character? It barely matters, but, alright. I can't beat around the bush too much. This is not a good game. Enemies are almost all hit scan, so the gameplay is pure reflexes and abusing corners again, just like Wolfenstein. Even the setups for encounters haven't changed. The moment-to-moment action of Doom and Marathon is not here. In its place, Rise of the Triad loads up on so many environmental hazards that it sometimes feels more like a really sloppy 3D platformer. And the art is a mess. They're working under difficult constraints imposed by the Wolfenstein engine, and they've made some improvements to get this game at least looking better, but compared to Heretic and Marathon, Rise of the Triad is ugly. Part of it is these big, square, segmented textures. But even aside from that, the art direction just feels confused. What are these chairs and stools doing here? What am I meant to assume this room is? Even Wolfenstein presented more cohesive environments than this. There's even still a live system with extra life points collectibles. This game literally prompts you to load your save when you die. How did it not occur to them that these features contradict each other? There hadn't been an FPS with limited lives in almost 3 years. These levels are still boxes, for crying out loud. Angled walls had been the standard in every game since 1993. If this game came out before Doom, it'd be impressive, but in 1995, this is just sad. And working with these large boxes hamstrings the level design. There's only so much that can be done to make distinct, memorable room layouts when you're working with giant, nondescript squares. And the more ambitious these levels get, the more tedious the sprawling sameness becomes. Just looking at this map tells you everything you need to know. Rise of the Triad is a spiritual sequel to Wolfenstein 3D that envisions a world where Doom didn't exist, made by a team who doesn't seem familiar with the several successful games in this genre from the previous 2 years, led by the guy who was ousted from id for not understanding Doom. Why is it even called Rise of the Triad? There's no Triad in this game. It's Americans versus Nazis, because it's just Wolfenstein. But there's a reason Rise of the Triad feels so much like a Wolfenstein 3D sequel, and that's because it is one. Well, sort of. It started development all the way back in early 1993 as a Wolfenstein sequel, but when id went independent to finish work on Doom, Apogee were left with an unfinished game and an IP they no longer had access to. After rewriting the story and adjusting a few assets, Wolfenstein Rise of the Triad became Rise of the Triad Dark War. But the nearly 2 years that it took to finish development, combined with the team's failure to implement important engine upgrades seen in other releases in that time frame, led to Rise of the Triad feeling older than it really was. More than that, though, outdated design philosophy meant that the game feels right out of 1992 in more ways than one. At least the music is good. Like, really good, actually. These tracks are dynamic, with memorable hooks, intense drumming, varied instrumentation, great composition, and progression between verses. This is a great soundtrack. Rise of the Triad Dark War is a relic of a time that never was, a shadow of id's legacy, and a surprisingly uninspired start for what would become one of the most significant studios in the genre. It adds a lot of cutesy features that I would be excited about in an otherwise competent game, but breakable pots can't save a game whose level, enemy, and encounter design have not moved an inch since the genre's inception. After Rise of the Triad released, the developers of incredible power were disbanded. All of the game's designers left Apogee, but many of the artists and programmers for Rise of the Triad, as well as both composers, were folded back into the new brand, 3D Realms, whose first games would use a totally new engine made by a formerly independent programmer. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, other studios were happy to take a crack at Doom. If this old stuff is interesting to you, check out the rest of my series on classic first-person shooters to see what I have to say about Doom and more. And if there are any you think I should cover, leave a comment so that I can see. Join me next week for a trip to the stars.